Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
First of all, I'd be prepared to concede the point that there aren't any societies that don't exist without a small amount of greed. The second point arises that there is nothing in the doctrines of socialism or communism or anarchism that says greed is a bad thing. You know, you can have a completely greedy society that would be organised on socialist principles. All socialism says is that, and yeah, I say these points a lot, but free labour, free markets. You can work whenever you want to. If there is something that you use that enables you to work, then it is your right to work in that place. And then whatever you produce, you own. And if you want to trade with someone what you own, then that is completely fine. And it's possible that in a socialist society, especially, and I mean, I say in almost all socialist societies, there aren't any models of socialism really that I'm aware of that contradict this. In a socialist society, you can certainly have someone who has more possessions than other people. You can have someone who has a house, and in that house they've got works of art and gold and fanciest clothes and things like that. The only thing they cannot do in that society is use that money to take away from people what they need for their own advancement. The same way we live in a society where you can't use money to, or you shouldn't be able to, use money to pay for statesmen, to restrict the liberties of people. You can't pay for your own private police force to restrict the liberties of people. You can't pay for slaves to restrict the liberty of people. And this is socialism, you cannot pay for the means of production to restrict the liberties of other people. You can't cordon off different parts of the world for yourself other than the parts that you will use for yourself, you know. So there's no reason why you cannot be greedy in such a system. But I think there are 2 points to consider. The first point is the rational greed. You know, we talk about rational greed is basically when you look out for your own self-interest. But I think and this is fine, if you want to just look out for your own self-interest, there is no reason you cannot live in a socialist society and function, and a socialist society would function even if every single person just looked out for their self-interest, because socialism enables that. The only thing, you know, I've already said, you know, the things you can't do in a socialist society, but I think there's a different form of greed, which is the point at which power and capital and control become a source of almost lust and worship. You know, people who just want to amass more. And I think that's something that the huge stocks of money that you see in a capitalist system bring about. In a socialist system, you can have money, you can not have money. It depends on what's practical in a given situation. But you wouldn't have the amounts of money that enable you to buy factories. You wouldn't have the amounts of money that enable you to pay off politicians and things like that, because that is the type of money that people have when they start to idolise money, when they start to think, oh, I've got billions of pounds. The amount of money you could get in a socialist society is the amount of money you could get from selling whatever it is you produce, and that's it. If you produce things that are incredibly valuable, then maybe you could have a lot of money. But I think socialism removes this idea that money means power over other people. The most you can do in a socialist society is get money, which you can then maybe use to have a better quality of life. And at no point could you really run into conflict with other people who are just trying to have the best quality of life that they can have. The other point I wanted to consider is the fact that certain systems are more likely to bring about charitable people. And as an example of this, I would pick a system that I think capital or free market capitalists or neoliberal capitalists might agree with, which is that an example of a society that might not bring about the most charitable attributes is a society that forces people to pay for the well-being of others. In such a society, people don't have any reason to consider the moral virtue of charity, they're simply forced to do it by the state. But a system that creates fraternity, and a system that's based on a principle that, yeah, you can be richer than other people, but you can never impose yourself on other people in any real way. You can never, imagine everyone just goes about living their day-to-day life. In a socialist system, if you just did everything you did every day, there would be no point, really, at which someone could say, no, you can't do that. Because what most people do in their day is they go to their house, and then they go to work, and then they maybe go out to a public place, like a bar or something, and then they go back home. And in a socialist system, you cannot ever stop anyone from doing any of those things. You can't force someone not to work. You can't force someone not to enter a public place, unless they're being incredibly rowdy or something like that. But you can't, for example, force someone not to go to a public place because they're black. And there wouldn't be any private owners of such public places. So, it would be a community aspect. If someone walks into a pub and they're being completely rowdy, then they'll get thrown out by a group of guys the same way that they are currently. Socialism wouldn't affect your life in a way that causes any antagonism between you and other people. You don't have to hate your boss because you don't have a boss. You don't have anyone who says, I'm docking your wages. The only person who can dock your wages is you, by choosing to work less or at a lower quality. Because of this, I think it would be more likely to bring about charity. Because while in my conception of a socialist society, I would be under no obligation to pay for, say, a disabled person who can't work for whatever reason, or maybe I'd be under no obligation to help someone put in some nice wood panelling in their house or whatever. I would be more likely to choose to do so, because in a socialist society, I would have a great deal more free time. All I'd need to do to get by in a socialist society is produce something that gives me the money necessary to pay to get my way through life. If, suppose, what I'm doing now, let's suppose hypothetically, it's a socialist society, and all I need to do is make a video, and however much money I make from that video, from donations, or maybe even from advertisements could be a thing in a socialist society, although it's slightly less likely. But all of that money goes to me. It doesn't go to YouTube, because YouTube aren't making these videos. YouTube is just saying that in order to make these videos and host them on this site, I have to give them a percentage of any money I may earn. But, and I also don't have to pay taxes. So when you take all of that into account, I'm getting 10 times as much money as I'd get when you take into account both the money taken from YouTube and money taken from the government. And this becomes more obvious when you look at more practical work, like if your job is to make trainers or sneakers, then no taxes, no wages. You've just got your sneakers, and then, as I've discussed before, you would sell them to someone else who then sells it to other people, and you make basically 100%, give or take, the value of what you produce. So you have a lot more free time. You have a lot more free time to go about and work for other people for free. Now in a capitalist system, you don't have that free time. For starters, the majority of capitalist systems, even the system that Milton Friedman proposes, even though he is a neoliberal, he isn't an anarcho-capitalist, so he supports some form of taxation, which means that in your day-to-day lives, something is going to the government, and then even more is going to go to the capitalist class, and that is going to cause the majority of the money you produce, or the majority of the value you add to the economy, not to go to you, but to go to these higher up people in the government and in the business classes. Now, in the system, you're less likely to find people who have the time or the motivation to work with their community, because it creates kind of this antagonism where you have to compete with other people because there's only a set amount of work available in society. We have this thing called unemployment, which is ridiculous, of course, because there are houses that need building, there's energy that needs providing, there are still lots of jobs to do, but we have unemployment because the people who decide who does the jobs, the capitalist class, do not want to spend their capital having people work. But in a socialist society, if there's a job that needs doing, you go out, you do it, you get all the money. Now, because there is this limited amount of work, it automatically removes the sense of common identity, and in that sense I would say that a capitalist society is more likely to bring about greed on a personal level. But none of this is to say that greed is a huge problem, and I don't think many people think that greed, in the sense it's being used here, which is to say rational self-interest, is a problem. It's only when it becomes an obsession that it's a problem, and that is something that is very easily avoided, even in capitalist societies, as long as they're not ridiculous capitalist societies.
In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade.
I really dislike this argument. So you have to understand history in order to understand this. First of all, there is a talk done where it's basically talking about all the non-Western countries that have escaped poverty. And I believe there are about 6 mentioned: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Israel, and I don't think I can remember the last one. Singapore. And these are basically your 6 countries in all of the world, in all the non-Western world, the Western world being Europe and North America. These are your only countries that can be said to have escaped poverty. And for the most part, these have been countries that have been relatively independent of Western colonialism. Certainly Japan has held up very well. So we see that there's this very strong connection between being a former European colony and being poor today. And there is a combination between being a massive imperial power and being very rich today. And you can count, I would say, the USA as something of an imperial power, given the scope of their intervention in international politics. Now, that isn't to say that they are an international power in the same way that Europe was, but they use military force to extract wealth and gain influence on a global scale. And as far as I'm concerned, that's an imperial power. Now, when you consider this, you realize that the reason why some countries are rich and some countries are poor is because the very rich countries were very exploitative of the poor countries. Okay? And when you look at it like this, saying that rich countries have become rich because of capitalism is a bit weird. It's like saying rich countries have become rich because of feudalism, or rich countries have become rich because of the military-industrial complex and having large standing armies. I mean, European countries have been the major, or European and East Asian countries have been the major advances of huge standing armies historically, and obviously North America has entered into this later. But the reason for this is because having standing armies enables you to be very exploitative of poorer countries and poorer people. It enables you to quell uprisings domestically and internationally. and I would argue the same is true of capitalism. The fact that Europe had a system, and I'm not talking about capitalism here, I'm talking about feudalism. Europe had a system where there was a massive connection between having power and being a landowner, and the idea was that taxation was basically rent, so you owned all of the land, and then all the people who worked the land paid you rent, and at the same time, to be paid rent was basically to be a feudal lord, which made you a member of the government. So there's this huge connection between private property rights and government power. And then eventually this malformed, which is something I'll go into in a later video, but I suppose you could argue that it progressed in some sense into a capitalist system, which basically means that you still have the same idea of controlling private property and people paying you rent, or in this case giving you what they produce and then you pay them a wage. But it's not difficult to imagine that the connection between the huge amounts of wealth that Western countries have, which is largely grounded in exploitation, parallels to the huge amounts of wealth that the very rich have in these countries, which is also probably because of a large amount of exploitation, at least historically. Even if you don't disagree with capitalist property rights, you have to disagree, I think, with feudalist property rights. Now, when you put all of this together, who's to say that if we assume that development has to be based on some moral imperative, and we assume that it is wrong that countries have become developed because of exploitation, then there's no reason to say that capitalism is better, because capitalism is better in the same sense, at least based on what I just said, capitalism is better in the same sense that stealing, just outright stealing from another country is better. Yes, the country will be richer in comparison, but that doesn't mean that the system is moral. It means that it's connected to the same exploitative mechanisms that can bring about phenomenal amounts of wealth for certain portions of the global economy.
And what does reward virtue? You think the communist commissar rewards virtue?
A system that rewards virtue is a system that is largely based on free enterprise and free association. So there are two elements to this. The first element is more explicitly socialist, which is to say that a system that rewards virtue would be a system that directly compensates you for whatever you bring to society. So if you bring large amounts, if you produce lots of cars, then you sell those cars, and because you live in a socialist system where you own the cars you produce, it automatically rewards your virtue. And to go back to a point I make in a different video about kind of how people might manage and distribute resources, if you're very good at managing and distributing resources, then you are rewarded for that virtue. So that's the first point to consider, which is the economic free enterprise. But the other point to consider is the social free association. And what I mean by this is essentially a system where you're much more likely to base what you, or who you fraternize with, on just general feelings towards certain people. So there's no contractual stipulations that you have to like your boss, or you have to like someone who's a member of a really big company. You can just like your mates, and you can work for your mates in your free time, as I discussed before. So you can be less greedy, you can just work with people. And if you live a life that is very horrible, you pump mercury into the water, and then first of all I think that would be a case when the law would have something to say about it. But I'm trying to speak abstractly here, so I'm not really going to go into issues of what the state should do. But if you do that, then you are likely to cause people to take a tremendous amount of issue with you personally. And because socialism is very interconnected, you have to trade with people. It means that it automatically rewards virtue, because if no one wants to trade with you, then you're basically going to have to do everything yourself. You know, maybe you can have an allotment, you can feed yourself, but if no one wants to trade with you, you're not going to get an iPhone or a car or anything like that. So, system that rewards virtue would be socialist free markets. You get what you produce, you fraternise with whomever you convince you ought to be fraternised with, and throughout all of this, you have to be generally a good, productive member of society. You can't just get by being powerful or manipulating a system. So all of this is to say that I think, as is often the case, I agree with neoliberals on a lot of points. I just wish they'd understand that the system they're advocating is not the freest market. It's not a free market if there are contractual stipulations on how you contribute to that free market. So that is that. Just